Okay, so thank you everyone for joining us. This is the third webinar through the Southern Vermont Economy Project, which is a capacity building program at BDCC, and that's funded by the USDA Rural Development. Last week, or the past couple weeks, have been focused on sort of very, very short term, like here is how to Zoom, because for some of us, that's a very new technology. And so I did a webinar on that. Then the second week was on short-term impacts for municipalities. This week is on sort of what towns are doing and what adaptations have been made to sort of daily business, as well as sort of reflecting a little bit on Tropical Storm Irene and any lessons learned from that situation. And then next week will be the fourth of the final one, at least for this month. We'll be talking about long-term impacts. And we'll sort of start that webinar off with some graphics from Joe Minicozy, who was our keynote speaker last year at the summit. He's got some pretty interesting graphs and data on sort of how to think about our current situation and how that will be impacting us for years to come. So we have Gretchen Heverluck, who's the economic development specialist for the town of Wilmington, and as well as the town manager of Wilmington, Scott Tucker. Then we also have Patrick Moreland, who's the assistant town manager for the town of Brattleboro, and Forrest, the town clerk of the town of Marlborough. So essentially, this is the agenda, very kind of short and loose, but we're going to start off with Gretchen and Scott in the town of Wilmington and just hear from them on some of those adaptations that they're having to make, whether it's sort of the daily operations that would typically happen at the town offices, how they're currently running business through committees and boards and their processes, and then also what are those gaps being filled with, whether it's volunteers or mutual aid. And then if there are any questions from anyone else who's on the call, you can either use the raise hand function, which is if you hit the participant button that pops up the list of who's in there. At the bottom is the raise hand function, and it's going to be a pretty open discussion. So if you have a question for that person who's talking, we can sort of insert the question as we go. So I'm going to hand it off to Gretchen.
Okay. Thank you all for being on the call, and Sarah, thank you for asking me to speak today. I'm going to speak more to the lessons learned from Irene. Scott is going to talk about the day-to-day stuff in Wilmington. So the one thing is that recovery takes time. We're still kind of in crisis mode, working on recovery things. So I mean, it's 9 years later. I really am thinking, okay, we're gonna be able to get this cleaned up in a couple of months and we'll be back and running that way. And of course, it was different severity for different businesses at the time, because we were affected really deeply by our downtown, which has multiple businesses. So, and the thing about that I think really struck, that's really super different this time is that during Irene, we were able to go in, after it had, raised havoc, and we were able to physically clean up, and you felt like you were accomplishing something, and that, it was physical labor, you were mucking out your building, you're rebuilding, you were painting, making it look better, and, feeling good about your business and reopening. And, we're not able to do that this time. There's no physical labor. It's just that we kind of have to wait. And I think that's really super hard for everybody right now. you know, and again, we still have vacant buildings in Wilmington from Irene. So it's really hard to rebuild from that. The other thing is public promotion, you know, rallying the troops. And I think this is something that Vermonters are really good at. We, you know, come together, we help each other, and that is happening now. People are making masks, you know, there's all of these great things that are happening out there that people are carrying. They're, you know, helping people do grocery shopping, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of outpouring. And, you know, there's, and I really love like how slogans come up. So during Irene, you know, we had Vermont Strong, and then we had for Wilmington, Wilmington Where Amazing Happens, were promotional posters that were put up all over. And then, you know, this time we've got the Hello campaign, and we are doing here in Wilmington, a local artist and a printer has put together, you know, like, let's see, Dover, Wilmington, you know, something, and it's a big, huge rainbow, and it says throughout using the words from the town, strong. So it's like Eastover, Westover, you know, and Wilmington, we're strong. So that's pretty cool. The other piece that was really challenging was SBA from the get-go for businesses. And I'm not going to talk a lot about this because I know we're on a municipal call, but I think it's important to process because you hear people saying these things out there. So like I was, the SBA was really difficult during Irene. And, you know, people went to sign up, the businesses, and they were like, oh, it's a loan. And so then people walked away, and they were not told at the time that they should just register and register what their loss is, because this is how a disaster is determined about how much money that you get into the state. So we had to calculate through my work that I was doing with the BDCC as a flood recovery officer, and we had to substantiate the dollar amount so that we could get funding. So that was challenging. So I was very optimistic when the SBA came around. You know, they had these two programs, and I really thought that, you know, oh, they're much better. I'm the optimist. And, you know, that has really not been true, because they have been changing the rules from the get-go, and it's been very, very challenging for businesses. The other piece was FEMA. So when FEMA came in for Irene, we unfortunately got a team that was brought out of retirement. So the challenge was that they were not up to date on the latest information from FEMA, and they were not up to date on resources. So we were kind of flapping in the breeze, and they were trying to figure it out too as we went. So there was good and bad in the FEMA portion. I think that they tried and they did their best, but it was a super challenging time, because it was like you did something and then it was like, no, that's not the way that you do it. You got to do it this way. And so you were constantly jumping through hoops that you didn't really have time for because you had already done it once. So, you know, I know that we will, FEMA will be participating in something. I'm not sure what that's going to look like for our state. And how it will drill down to municipalities. I'm not sure about that. So that would be interesting to see. But hang on. And I just want to say that the biggest, this is my last point, is we are so fortunate, you know, in Irene to have, you know, Wyndham Regional Commission. They were always right there near us going, what do you need? What do you need? as well as the BDCC was there constantly helping us. The state helped us with some grants through community development block grants. They were disaster recovery grants. And so those were helpful to our town. So we had those state and regional assistance, but we also had our second homeowners that came together. They raised probably almost $1 million between the two organizations for our businesses to recover in Wilmington. It was just unbelievable how they came together and raised all of this money for us. And now we're seeing, you know, like everyone is affected by this, not just the people that were, you know, affected by a flood. The second homeowners are being affected as well, especially in our hotspots of New York City and Boston right now. But I have to say that it's really, you know, there was a lot of people that, you know, have a lot of angst against them for being here right now. And, you know, but a lot of them have been responsible. And again, I have to say that I see people that are residents that are not following CDC guidelines, but I see a lot of our second homeowners following those CDC guidelines. And so it's not them against us, it's more about those people that are not following the CDC guidelines is key. But the second homeowners are rallying right now, and they have started through the organization of Friends of the Valley, and they have started raising funds. So, and they are going directly to individuals, families that are truly impacted significantly. So they're working through all of that. And I think that's it, but I just have to say, hang on, it's a bumpy ride. And it will never be the same as it was, because that's, you know, how life is. But be assured, as my grandmother used to tell me, this too shall pass.
Great, thank you so much, Gretchen. It's great to hear that, you know, despite maybe some of the negative attitudes that the second homeowners are receiving, that they're still rallying and you know, care about this area as well as, I'm sure, their hometown.
Yes, for sure.
Great, thank you. So if there are any questions for Gretchen, please either raise your hand or type into the chat function. We're going to move on to Scott, but we can sort of fluctuate back and forth if there are any questions that come up. So Scott, you're up.
Thank you, Sarah. So I'm more the nuts and bolts from Wilmington. And if you hear some truck traffic, that's where my office is, right next to the road. So I can't do much about that. So the question is, how is your town adapting, and how are we doing our daily operations? So in general, our number one priority has been the health and safety of our employees, with the number two being mission driven or continuity of government and service delivery. And so right from the beginning, our department heads understood that flexibility would be key to ensure employee safety and health, and not necessarily a fair distribution of who needs to stay home and then who can work. Although I have to say most of our employees would rather work than stay at home. So department heads have had the authority to send people home if employees appear overly tired, because we are concerned about their mental health and the strain on them and their families, and anyone who might be coming down with a cough or a cold. So we stress that it's important to consider mental health in our personnel as well as physical health. In regard, we have about 27 full-time employees. We had 5 employees who represented the police department, town hall, and highway department, they were sent home over the last 5, almost 6 weeks now. So one recovered after testing positive for COVID-19, and that person was very sick, recovered, and returned to work. Another one had had contact with that same worker and did not test positive, but that person was sent home for 14 days. 2 other employees presented with a cough or cold. They were sent home for 14 days. And another person who may have a compromised immune system is working with their doctor and is staying home. So all in all, I think we've had pretty good luck. So the hallmark for local government, in my estimation right now, is an abundance of care and caution at this time to keep everybody healthy and available for work. All employees are practicing safe social distancing, the use of face masks where it's appropriate or it's a personal choice. Increased personal hygiene and disinfection of workspaces, of course. Our janitorial services, we contract for a janitor, so he was concerned, his wife is a nurse, and they were concerned in terms of how much contact he would have in our workspace. So he's coming in on Sundays and also doing some additional work for the police department in their entryway. And if there's an arrest, there's a little bit more work to do in their booking area. All town buildings are locked to public access. Telecommuting is encouraged, and now appointments are screened if deemed essential. Which should not be that many. And if someone is coming into the building, and typically right now it's just for the town clerk, which I'll get to in just a minute, but the same rules apply. Social distancing, masks are required, hand washing is required prior to going into the office space, along with continual social distancing. I probably repeat that too many times. The town hall, so everyone has their own office. We're fortunate that way. Everyone has their own office space within town hall, with the exception of the clerk's office. And so most offices are able to access their computers from home. In terms of the town clerk, she has one assistant. They do not have separate offices, so they're using staggered shifts. So a Monday, Tuesday, and a Wednesday through Friday, and then they flip it the following week. Now, what's interesting is we're currently in transition. The select board appointed a new town clerk to take effect May 1st. And so they will have potentially 3 in the office during this next 2 weeks for training purposes. But that's an exceptional challenge, I think, during these times, not just with COVID-19, but we're in a period of townwide reappraisal. Everyone knows the primary is coming up, the presidential election, and then on to town meeting, not to mention any other Board of Abatement type meetings with regard to people's ability, landowners' ability to pay. So anyone who is allowed in will be on a case-by-case basis. That means someone in the clerk's office plus 1 other person, with a caveat, again, that our masks are worn, hands are washed, and there's no other access to the building except to the clerk for their business and then back out. Interestingly enough, town clerk has, most of her files are electronic, and so people can access most of the land records through electronic portal. And what has happened in this case, people who were reluctant to use that portal previously are now being taught to use it. So I think that's been a positive sort of thing. In terms of myself, the town manager, I work from the office most of the time. I have been taking some homework for Fridays. There's typically no in-person contact except with employees. That includes, again, social distancing, use of masks for personal comfort. My administrative assistant works 2/3 from home, usually in the office Mondays and Tuesdays, since everyone likes to be paid, and she does a fair amount of that work. The finance office is usually here Mondays and Tuesdays. Many times she will be here half days or is working from home the rest of the time. And of course, that's simply to keep everything going, payroll, payables, accounts receivable, and all the other deadlines that we have to meet. Now, I think to some degree, we were probably fortunate as a town because our property taxes were due in February, just before all of this hit. So the bulk of our tax revenues are already in place. The lister's office, listers are not allowed in the building and must contact the lister's administrator by email or phone. And as I told you, we're in the midst of a townwide reappraisal, so the work has been challenging when considering the listers and the use of outside contractors for a lot of this work when talking about commercial, specialty ski, business properties, residential, and a new software vendor. So the listers administrator is working half-time, roughly half-time from home, and contractors' work is either exchanged at the door or screened for an appointment where masks are worn by both parties, since she does not have enough space in her office to get exactly 6 feet, but it's pretty close. Zoning administrator, health officers working primarily from home. Every once in a while they'll come in to do some work, but it's on a limited basis. The town nurse always works from home, and so continues to do that, and is doing no in-contact visits. Most of her work is connecting folks to resources at this point. The wastewater treatment plant is in a separate building. The chief operator and his assistant are alternating work days. The only time they're together would be for emergencies. Highway department is in a separate building. For 2 weeks, they created 2 teams, and then they had some people who were out sick for a while, so the 2 teams didn't work. But for 2 weeks, they had 2 teams, and now, just to a large degree, they have their own separate truck. If they can't be separated, then 2 workers would have to be wearing masks. And our concern through all of this was, because we have almost 70 miles of roads, is not losing any of our gravel or dirt roads. Fire department is in a separate building. The chief is the only full-time employee. Firefighters are volunteers, and they're masking and using PPE when they are going out on a call. They have not had many calls, which has been, I think, good news. And so there haven't been the usual crashes or fire calls. They've had, I think, 1 or 2 calls since this all started. Chief Moore is also our emergency management director, and he has ongoing discussions with WRC and the Vermont Emergency Management. The regional coordinator for Vermont Emergency Management and the Southern Vermont Medical Center and Deerfield Valley Rescue and others to determine what potential surge or needs would be in this area. When they do go to a call, they are asking residents some primary questions with regard to, particularly if they've been from out of state, whether they've quarantined and things of that nature. Remember, statewide, there's no fire permits. That includes here. Communications with Keene Mutual Aid is ongoing, which is our dispatch center for fire. Protocols for distancing, decontamination, PPE, and all his firefighters being volunteers are adhering to the rules. Older firefighters are prioritizing calls, and when the call dictates, there may be a need for extra personnel where the older firefighter are truck operators, and they're doing no interior work at this point. That's about 4 out of our 30 volunteers. We have a captain who also works for the ambulance system, and he's in charge of monitoring CDC guidelines and particularly infectious disease control in that area. Police department is in a secure part of the town hall. They obviously are working every day. We have 6 officers, so typically there may be only 2 on at a time. So keeping distancing is easy within the office structure. However, they have had to make several arrests and go hands-on where PPE, gloves, masks, and the N95 mask are utilized. What's interesting is we had one officer in the Vermont Police Academy going to the full-time academy. And what has happened there is they suspended the academy, but now going back to the police academy. So our one employee is being quarantined for 14 days in a specific site. He will not be able to come home for weekends, and that will go until about May 29th. In addition, we were asked to volunteer somebody as a teaching assistant, so that person is quarantined. He's a single person, so he can quarantine at home and for 14 days before going to the academy. Landlords, of course, are getting education from the police department. They're getting many calls from the public regarding out-of-state people who have traveled here to their second homes. In 2 cases, the question was whether or not an Airbnb had rented. And after investigating, they determined that those folks were not renting, and the use of that particular house had to do with friends or family who were utilizing the house. So there were no cases sent to the Attorney General's office. We're getting calls on parking with regard to folks parking along roads where they normally don't and walking into the lake region. The police department is ordering additional PPE, N95 and surgical masks. What they found was Taser said they had a lot of free stuff, and when they went to apply for that, there were 8,000 responses before they had to close down their site, and they were out. In some cases, masks that usually cost $2 are now going for $6, but he found a pretty good deal, I think, on Amazon. There were several arrests, required close contact. Police chief is working with the chamber and other organizations locally with regard to a lot of phone calls he's getting. And so you heard from Gretchen as the economic development consultant, but she has also been working on community loans, and the select board set aside $100,000, and out of which they have loaned $96,000 to about a dozen local businesses. Those checks went out. 2 went out last week, and the rest will go out this week. And we've already heard back from some of the businesses that are very grateful. Running business of the town with regard to committees, boards, and processes. Some committees have elected not to hold meetings, and the Development Review Committee is hearing cases via either free conference call or Zoom. The Planning Commission doing the same. Other committees have the option, though some have canceled the meetings. The Select Board's last in-person meeting was held March the 17th with social distancing first being practiced. I think we're better at it now than we were then. And all their other meetings have been, including special meetings, have been via Zoom. Our shortest meeting that I can remember was last night. We closed with 45 minutes. The select board members are signing warrants and necessary documents in person at town hall. We've set up, there's a reception desk that we allow them to use, and they have not been walking throughout the building. Volunteer mutual aid, filling the gaps. I think there's a robust willingness to volunteer, particularly with the local clubs, Rotary, nonprofits such as Wilmington Works, the Lions Club. And then there's individual volunteers that are providing cloth masks and making themselves available. So there's a list. The Wilmington Works is maintaining a list of volunteers and people who are asking for help, and anyone who contacts the police department is getting connected with the right folks. I think that's enough for now.
Great, thank you so much, Scott. If there are any questions for Scott, again, please use the raise hand or type into the chat function, and we'll move on to Patrick, and we can do questions also at the end of everyone speaking if there's more general questions for the group. All right, Patrick, take it away.
All right, well, thank you, Sarah. And I just want to compliment Scott on a very complete and thorough report. I would like to remind those on the call today, I actually didn't prepare specific comments. So while I'll speak to many of the same things Scott spoke to and Gretchen spoke to, I may leave some things out, and I apologize for that. But I guess I'd like to start with where Gretchen started. And interestingly enough, she pointed out just before the start of this meeting that it was Irene where we met each other and the beginning of the Irene recovery. And I am surprised the degree to which the COVID-19 disaster is, at least in our present day experience up until now, totally different than Irene. Irene was a traditional disaster, right? It was a flood. There were roads washed out. There were bridges washed out. There were facilities that were, inundated and flooded. we're pretty good at bouncing back from those types of events. They're challenging and difficult and painful, but we know how to rebuild roads and we know how to reset bridges, and we're really good at that kind of stuff. So it was a time for all of us to step up and do what we were already good at. COVID-19's very different. I would say it's characterized mostly by just not knowing, right? You can't tell by looking at somebody if they've got COVID-19. You don't know how long you're going to be asked to stay at home. We don't know exactly when we're going to open it back up. And if we open it back up, are we going to open up quickly? Are we going to open up slowly? Or you know, the range of unknowns is pretty tremendous. So it's very different from our experience thus far. And similarly, with respect to our engagement with FEMA, obviously during Irene, the engagement with FEMA was pretty profound. We worked with them for seemed like about a year and a half. I think we did really good work with them. But you know, so many of our extraordinary expenses were eligible for FEMA reimbursement. And so in the end, the town was essentially made whole. But what that speaks to is we had so many additional expenses. Now take a look at COVID-19. Very quickly after we started recognizing a disaster was unfolding, we set up separate accounting for COVID-19 expenses. And to this day, you know, it's maybe $1,000, maybe $1,500. I mean, they're just, I can't point to a set of expenses beyond some additional masks, some additional, we're going to get some sneeze guard type plexiglass things. But, you know, I mean, these are measured in hundreds of dollars, not hundreds of thousands of dollars. So I think it's really important that the national declaration occurred. I would imagine the state of Vermont has incurred a tremendous amount of additional expenses, but I would say at the municipal level, the additional expenses are pretty limited. So we don't have a lengthy engagement with FEMA public assistance to look forward to. And I think, you know, there's enough going on that's a welcome result. In terms of continuity of government, you know, as soon as, or rather just before the stay-at-home order, we had made the decision, just like Wilmington, to go ahead and close all public facilities. And you know, for about a week there, we were all reporting to work and continuing on as normal, transacting business with the public via the mail. And that worked fairly well, but with the stay-at-home order, you know, we made some substantial changes, and among them, we shut down our entire parking system. So we've got a parking enforcement unit with a number of staff, and we decided that it just didn't make sense to continue to provide a function where individual members of the public were supposed to go up and start, you know, touching all these little buttons, and then staff would be collecting all these quarters and nickels and dimes that everybody had been touching. And it just seemed like an opportunity for real rapid transmission. And so we shut down the parking system. And then with the stay-at-home order, we actually sent virtually everybody home, and then began the process of trying to figure out, well, who among our staff are able to complete their work and work from home, and who can't. That also taught us another lesson, which is we didn't have adequate virtual private network software set up so that everybody could securely reach the relevant sections of the town server from their remote locations. And so we did a lot of work very quickly, and we got about 30 or 40 staff set up to be able to access the locations on the server that are important for their function. But a lot of staff, you know, don't work on computers, and so I think we're in a place now where everybody is in position to be able to operate remotely, and that's a big help. In terms of the services, police and fire continue, I wouldn't say as normal, but police continue to patrol the streets, and the fire department continues to respond to calls. I know that our dispatch is asking a whole series of new questions when calls come in, and even when either the police or fire or both arrive to a particular scene, they're doing a sort of a doorway assessment to, you know, what do I see going on in here? And so they're being much more careful and donning masks and gloves and what have you as is appropriate. The police department is interestingly also taking the stance that they're not going to respond to calls that are not, shall we say, of an urgent nature. So if there's threats of violence, if there are, you know, people putting hands on each other, absolutely we're going to respond. But, you know, in an effort to sort of avoid person-to-person contact, you know, what I would say is the little stuff is probably not gaining a lot of attention at this point in time. Public Works, just like with Wilmington, our staff split up into the A team and the B team in an effort to try and, you know, minimize the amount of potential contact in between individual staff members. They really greatly increased the frequency with which they're cleaning their vehicles so that, you know, the steering wheels are wiped down with, you know, Clorox wipes and that sort of thing after every use. And let's see, what else is going on? I would say that the office staff, finance, planning, town clerks, they're largely working from home. I know I am mostly, although I happen to be in the office today. There are still, from time to time, things that need to be signed and certain things that have to be performed in person. What I would say from the experience so far, first we had a whole lot of, let's say, human resources decisions, right? Are we going to furlough or lay off any employees? Are we going to support people to be able to work from home? And so we had a lot of that kind of activity, and that took up the early couple of days. We quickly transitioned to, you know, we got to figure out how to do these Zoom meetings. And in the end, we started working with GoToMeeting and, you know, got the select board back up and running. And actually, we had a really good meeting last night. I think we're getting pretty good at these virtual meetings. It's a little different, but, you know, it can be done. We are gradually bringing up other committees. The Planning Commission has already met several times. We're bringing up the DRB in the next month. We're all about right now, how can we continue to serve the public as we always have, maybe doing it a little differently, but continuing to provide the same services. And one of the functions that a lot of us, myself included, are working on are, hey, how many projects can we get lined up and ready to go such that when either the all clear, or at least the beginnings of an all clear, let's get back to work mindset begins to become acceptable, that we hit the ground running. And so we're focusing on preparing for you know, all sorts of construction and other projects, so that you know, when we get the ability to do so, that we're prepared to act. Separate and apart from that, obviously we're spending a good deal of time looking at the budget, looking at our revenues. We do, as opposed to Wilmington or Marlborough, which is once a year, we do 4 quarterly payments. So we've got another payment still coming in May. What I can say is we've been keeping really close eye on the receipts in the treasurer's office, and at this point in time, everything's coming in very normally. So we're at the same place we are in terms of collections this year as we were at this time last year. So we're feeling pretty good about that. We're avoiding expenses wherever possible, and just trying to serve the public as efficiently in this new way as we can. And the last thing I'm going to say, and then I'll shut up, is I think Gretchen actually had another point, which was the the recovery is really the longest thing. I think municipal operations are going to bounce back pretty quickly and readily. The economic recovery is going to be a long, slow road, and it remains to be seen what that road really looks like. So look forward to working with all of you on getting back to work.
Thanks, Patrick. I actually have two questions and a comment for you. One, I really appreciate your comment about sort of starting to plan for projects that you can sort of hit the ground running as soon as all of this is over, whatever that means. You know, I think something I worry about is because it seems like most people are kind of operating in a just day-to-day thing because of all of the unknowns. I'm afraid that, you know, once it is clear, not only municipalities, but nonprofits, businesses are going to be like, oh, crap, like now, like what about all those projects that we had thought about doing or had started? And there's, you know, they're going to lose a lot of time because they're not only thinking about day to day, but also like what can we get done now so that when it is time, we don't lose a ton of time because of all this. So I think that's really important. And I think, you know, in our webinar next week, when we talk about sort of the long-term impacts, you know, that will be a really good point to bring up. My question though, do you know if, I know town of Brattleboro, we were having a lot of issues with car break-ins. I'm just curious if you feel like those have stopped or slowed down, just, you know, based on, you know, you were saying police aren't necessarily responding to the low urgency things. And I'm just curious if they've seen a drop in those types of crimes.
Yeah, I would say that the car break-ins that were happening a couple of months ago and probably got quite a bit of attention, they actually began to significantly drop off after a couple of arrests. You know, one person can break into a lot of cars.
Sure.
So those began to drop off significantly before COVID-19. I haven't actually kept up with, you know, are there any ongoing concerns, but I certainly haven't heard much about that since a few months ago. Yeah,
great. And my other question was, I know for the town of Brattleboro, I'm not sure about the other towns on the call, but you have a new select board member, and I'm just curious, like, how that onboarding has gone when normally you would be doing it in person, if virtually it's been on track, I guess.
Well, I know the town manager, Peter, spends a good deal of time one-on-one with new board members.
Great.
We make all manner of written materials available to them, and Ian, like a lot of new board members, begins to spend quite a bit of time at select board meetings, and had been participating regularly for a while. So I think he's getting up to speed and doing a great job.
Great, awesome. Thank you so much, Patrick. Again, if anyone has specific questions for Patrick, please raise your hand or use the chat function. We're going to move on to Forrest from the town of Marlborough, and then we can do sort of general questions if people have any after Forrest talks.
Hi, can you all hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Great. So boy, we have a totally different set of circumstances, I think, being such a small municipality and being so rural comparative to Wilmington and Brattleboro, but it's great to hear how you all are doing. Very impressed. We have, you know, speaking about Irene, just such a different animal. You know, we have an invisible enemy out there, and that's pretty challenging to know what the right thing to do is. I think we, during Irene, we had a bunch of personnel problems happen midstream. I think in general, I'd say we were underprepared. And so I think there have been some interesting things that have come out of that. And again, the nature of this is so different. One of the things that's come out of it, I think, is that Marlborough cares has taken a very active role in some of the social needs that have come up that formerly would have fallen on the municipality's shoulders, as far as getting meals to seniors and that type of thing, and organizing volunteers. And I think, to the best of my knowledge, they have more volunteers than they have tasks, so that's a good equation. And the Marlborough Community Center, which is just, what is it, a year and a half old, something like that, is in the downstairs of the meeting house in the center of town. That likewise has been a fulcrum point where people can come at specific times and get supplies that they need. So those two things are great, and I think that in a way they did stem out of that Irene experience where we were all just sort of shocked, and people in general, many people on rural roads, they see that, you know, the culvert's washed out and they've got a tractor and they would just get to work, and created all kinds of challenges with reporting for FEMA. But at the same time, we put the roads back pretty quickly and heroically, I'd say, for all of us in Vermont. So at the moment, the biggest difference is just like Patrick was saying, is like there's nothing to, you know, we've gotten from Wyndham Regional Commission, you know, amazing resources, and like, you know, read this, check this out regarding FEMA, and we've got zero to say about that because nothing's happened. And then as far as the operations in the town go, I mean, I'm the town clerk, so I can speak about what we've done in the office, but it's really mostly just the treasurer and myself. We both have assistants. We decided, I think by March 15th, that we would none of us work in the office at the same time. You know, so we're staggered, and we've been closed to the public since then. And so what's happened is that mostly I've done a lot of work over email. I'm not, even at the moment, I'm pretty sure I'm not going to open the office to the public until May 15th per Governor Scott's order. I don't know, even at that time, you know, how we're going to handle that. I see a lot about, you know, ways that we can make plexiglass barriers and that type of thing to keep us safe. I'm not sure how that's going to go down, but basically what I've done as far as the town clerk operations is just jump right in and say to attorneys, real estate people, anyone who needs our records, is that I will provide them. It's a little bit of a you know, a legal challenge, I think, because obviously attorneys want to do their own title searches. I'm sticking my neck out. I know a lot of clerks are doing the same. We do not have our records online at this point. And again, it's a question of scale for us. It's just not economically feasible at this time. So that's a challenge. I'm not, well, that's a whole other ball of wax. Let's not go into that. Speaking with the treasurer yesterday, I think because we only bill one time a year, our biggest concern is going to be cash flow. And I know that we pretty typically get a line of credit, and that helps us bolster ourselves through. That is of a concern. We just did a reappraisal in 2018, so we're pretty good as far as tax billing. I'm also a lister, and we're pretty much, you know, in a place where it's very difficult to work accurately. We're obviously not going to do any interior inspections. We're going to do most of our appraisals by phone and email, which is far from the best, but we're just going to do what we can to try to meet our regular timelines, so that when tax billing comes around, it's the timeline that people are used to. That's the goal. Let's see. We have a website. People can pay bills online. That's been fabulous. I've got a lot of dog licenses paid that way, which is great. There's no, people don't have to come in. And then as far as the select board's been meeting by Zoom since just after town meeting, it's okay. you know, in such a small town, I'd say the biggest thing is there's just a lot of nothing. You know, there are businesses here, obviously, but they're mostly owner-operator. So we've not heard of any need, you know, from small businesses in need of aid. There's a sea of information out there that I assume people are going and getting for themselves. We have the whole situation with the college, which is pretty much unknown. I hear inklings of this and that, but you know, nothing's formalized yet. So that's just a giant question mark hanging over everything that's happening. But as far as the other committees, they're trying to meet remotely and continue their work. I know there was a DRB hearing last night. Again, the scale is so small. They're doing one thing. It takes an hour. It's we're able to continue along pretty well, I think, in general. So yeah, so the biggest thing is just going to be our tax billing season and how that's going to all go down. You know, there are a lot of ideas out there about you know, removing penalties and interest and that type of thing. We're not going to say yay or nay on that for some time still, just because we don't know.
Right.
And I guess that's sort of the long and short of it. I mean, I feel like for townspeople, you know, we don't offer a lot of services because there's not much to offer. Like, I mean, the volunteer fire department, they've done a pretty good job, I think, with PR telling people to not burn outside. So they've not had to, you know, go to many calls. It sounds like that's similar in Wilmington and Brattleboro as well. So that's good news. I think people in general are conscientious and trying to do the right thing. We've not heard much about second homeowners coming up and doing anything improper so far. So that's good news. So I think that's about it.
Great. Thank you so much for us. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, sure.
Just in the interest in time, are there any questions from anyone else who's on this call, whether Shane or Karen, John? If you have any questions for our speakers, or also anything maybe you'd like to share from your towns on what, you know, adaptations you are experiencing or putting into place. Hi, Shane.
Hi.
Is there anything you'd like to share or ask?
Mostly a share. One of the things that we were able to do this last year is put all of our records, or the records that I tend to use for, you know, planning and for town administration in the cloud. So everything I've needed to get, I have access to any day, and that's been very helpful. I've been, you know, working from home for a month at this point, not having gone into the office. It's both good and bad. But we've been able. That was a big thing that we did earlier this year. That was very, very helpful. And much like Marlborough, we're a relatively small town in Londonderry, and so I'd recommend that to any of the smaller towns. And also, we have PDF software, so I can take care of documents, sign them, adjust them, and things like that. So all of my zoning. I'm zoning administrator and town administrator, so all the zoning work is done remotely. We've held a DRB meeting already, and of course our select board and planning commission meetings are all done on Zoom at this point. One of the things we did do is a lot of test meetings ahead of time just to shake out the bugs. Yeah, and Sarah, your help was wonderful. Thank you.
Oh, great. Yeah, not a problem at all. I'm curious if all of your select board meetings that you're holding virtually, do you all still have public attending, and how are the executive sessions happening, are kind of my question. We
do have the public, with our DRB meeting, we had a couple of abutters chime in, which is kind of fun. What we do for executive sessions, we put everybody into a waiting room, and that seems to work. And we did back-to-back executive sessions at one point where we just came out and then voted to go back into another one.
Great. well, I'm glad that those features are available for these types of things.
Yeah.
Great. Jen, did you have something you wanted to share?
Yeah, I just wanted to, say, I mean, one of the things that was it's really helpful to hear you all talking about what you're doing. It's, in terms of this kind of a crisis, everybody trying to figure out like what our lane in it is and, what like a regional organization can do to add value. It helps us to really know. And I hope it's helpful for you to sort of hear from each other. And, we have conversations with different funders and, because one of our jobs is to obviously try to fund our programs, but another one is to try to get money into the area for everybody. And one of the things that I just heard, from Marlborough is that like the conversion to electronic records, not a thing that's worth the expenditure, but could be something, that would ease the administrative burden for the town over time. And that's the kind of thing, where I wonder if we need to look at, maybe some kind of application to the state or to USDA or somebody for the technical capacity to make that possible for towns so that it's just a, done deal. And it's not something you have to budget for, but it would sort of make these things, more, frankly, sustainable going forward so that, the one town staffer isn't going into the basement and pulling records all the time. And that's the kind of thing that I think, maybe we and Wyndham Regional and, folks like that can facilitate if we can identify enough communities that need something like that. And then just, to Gretchen's point about the SBA not being like a great fit for sort of what was happening after Irene, and FEMA not being, Patrick, to your point, FEMA not being a great fit for this crisis. And I think this is something we really puzzled over with the VY closure, that usually a closure and layoff is a DOL thing, but that wasn't a great fit for an industry where everybody who wanted to stay employed could relocate because there's so much demand for nuclear workers. I think we're trying to puzzle through right now, what is the mismatch? And then what do we do about it? We have a crisis. The federal government's rolling out certain programs for unemployment and for small businesses, but we know there's a mismatch. And we're trying to get our hands on like what the shape and size of that is insofar as it affects small businesses, but also towns and nonprofits. And like, we don't know it yet, but this is the kind of conversation that's helping us kind of get our head around like, what's the problem that's left over after the solutions come down from, on high. So thank you.
Thanks, Jen. Gretchen, you have your hand raised. Do you want to go ahead and unmute yourself?
Okay, there we go. Jen, thank you so much for bringing in, for talking about staying in your lane, because that is really key. That is something that it was really challenging in Irene, is that people were like jumping in and thinking that they were helping, but they really were not because they were duplicating efforts. So thank you for reminding me of that, because that was a huge lesson in Irene. But I did want to talk a little bit about, we talked about digitization of records, and the town of Wilmington actually got a community development block grant, disaster recovery implementation grant, to actually do that to our records. It was 2.5, 3 years of challenges, but we got it done, and that was really key, and it's key to how we operate today. So I just wanted to point that out, that we did get a grant, and it was through the community development block grant. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Gretchen. Representative Gannon, go ahead and unmute yourself. Great.
Sure, I want to talk about the same thing. Last year, the legislature passed a bill which increased town clerk fees. Along with increasing town clerk fees, it requires every town clerk to have a restoration fund, which part of those fees goes into. And so we are really trying to encourage all towns to use those funds to put their records online, because I think this crisis spells out how important it is to do that. Because I think the Senate Government Operations Committee is working on or is at least taking testimony about the issue that so many clerks' offices are not open, lawyers can't get access to the records. That's important because many, homeowners are trying to refinance their mortgages because they can't afford them. It's really critical that records go online. And, also, if any of you have ideas about things that the legislature could do to help municipalities please let me know. I'm on House Government Operations. You know, we're the ones that revise the open meeting laws. We have some relief coming to individual taxpayers so they don't have to pay the 8% penalty if the towns choose not to do that. You know, and you know, elections are going to be a challenge this year, as I think people know. But anything that you guys need, please let me know.
Thank you so much. We also have Karen Astley, who's the town manager of Putney, and she wanted to share just a little bit about what they've been doing. Karen? There you go.
Yeah. I'm still new at all this virtual meeting. We do use GoToMeeting, and I just want to be brief, but our concerns here in Putney are going to be possible abatements, elections, not having a school budget. So our taxes, our first bill will go out in July for an August payment, then in November and a February payment. So I'm thinking ahead, and I'm gonna wait till May to see what happens, but we may end up with 2 tax bills this year, which Putney did, you know, in the past, but it doesn't occur very often. My other concern is our private schools here in Putney, because everybody's online, and you know, even though you know, their tax revenue is small, they do contribute to the community in other ways. So that will impact Putney, and I'm really concerned about that. As far as operations, we're trying to keep business as usual the best we can. Digitizing our land records is on our radar, and possibly like a soft opening, especially with attorneys coming back online and appraisers and title researchers. But we'll see what the governor says, you know, after May 15th. And the one good thing here is that I've gotten the select board to take responsibility and different tasks to work in the community through this crisis. And I have to say they're doing a really good job. So we're all working together, and it's been good. I mean, we've been having meetings every week, whether it's a select board meeting, and then the following week is an emergency management meeting. So, you know, we did the planning, we're in the response mode right now, and we're also looking towards the recovery stage. So like everyone else, we don't know how long this is going to last, but that's where we're at right now.
Karen, can you elaborate a little bit on like what are some of the tasks that the select board members are taking on?
So our chair is very active, Laura Chapman, and I'm sure people have heard her name, but we have Putney Mutual Aid Committee. It's a group of volunteers, and we've collected all this data. We have surveys out there, and Laura's been working with that group. We have a local resource survey out there for produce and meat, you know, so people can buy local. There's a business survey out there trying to help our, like, you know, Putney Diner and the general store and the co-op and the Gleanery, you know, what are people are offering, you know, do you have takeout, do you have curbside? So we're trying to keep people in the community and supporting those local resources. One of our select board members is working with the emergency management director. So if he gets overwhelmed, you know, he can take on some of that responsibility. And our third select board, he's working with the business people. So he's making phone calls, and he has an automotive business himself. So he knows what the business community, you know, what their needs are. And they all have concerns too for our small businesses here in Putney. because some of them are the backbone, you know, and it's
Yeah.
like, how do we provide, you know, financial support to them, you know? So we've been reaching out, we utilize Wyndham Regional Resources, and we've been on the state website and getting those links for our people and trying to guide them. So that's what the select board are doing. They're guiding the community, you know, and they're not bombarded by a lot of questions, but they're active.
Right.
So, and like one of our, well, two of ours are business people. They have their own business,
Mhm.
you know, so they feel that, you know, stress and that financial impact. So I think it's working out great.
Great. Thank you so much, Karen, for sharing. I appreciate that.
Thank
Excuse me.
you.
Well, we're a little over time, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up. I did just want to highlight our last and final, at least for the month of April. Well, first of all, just a reminder, this will be is being recorded, so it's going to be up on the webpage, the SVEP webpage, so you can share that with people, or if you want to watch again. And then I really think next week's webinar is going to be really important for municipalities. You know, sort of what I was mentioning to Patrick earlier about, you know, how I'm you know, worried that some towns aren't necessarily thinking, you know, sort of to the future and what those long-term impacts are gonna look like. And Jen, I don't know if you just want to say a sentence or two about sort of the Minnecazi data and sort of what you, the takeaway message you feel will be for next week.
Yeah, I mean, I've been obsessed with this guy's work for like 10 years because, you know, he is a planner who's obsessed with land use and taxes and sort of how all of those things are framed. He spoke at our summit last year. He has done work. He's come to the state of Vermont and done some work in Burlington, and a lot of modeling that the state GIS folks are doing is really based on his concepts. It's sort of like looking at tax yield per acre and finding ways to analyze, you know, whether how your revenues are or not keeping up with your baseline infrastructure costs. And so we're gonna show some stuff that he's been doing more recently that gives some perspective on the different kinds of hits that municipalities feel. So there's sort of this real obvious, obvious, painful, immediate thing that we're seeing with retail and restaurants being closed down. And he kind of shows how that looks in terms of revenue changes. But in Vermont, we're very property tax heavy in terms of where we really, you know, get our wherewithal from for towns. And so he kind of shows how that played out in the last recession, which I think is just really informative in terms of figuring out, you know, when we start thinking about how to worry long-term, what might we want to look at? And then what might be the strategies to sort of address that. So he's super data heavy. We're going to show some of that stuff and then, you know, talk about whether it reflects the reality that people experienced 10 years ago here in the recession and whether we think it's applicable now. And if it gives some way to kind of frame local discussions about, you know, mitigating risk around sort of revenue changes. So.
Right. Great. Thank you, Jen. And I do just want to note, VLCT is holding a webinar at 2 today on municipal essential functions and services explained with Ted Brady, the Deputy Secretary of ACCD. So if you didn't already know about that, that might be something to look into. And that starts at 2 p.m. today, and you can get that info on their website. So. All right, thank you so much. I really appreciate you all being here and sharing what you're going through, and we'll see you next week, hopefully. Bye, everyone.